the public is largely influenced precisely by those seeking power. Finally, the third aspect of the folk theory of representation that makes it inadequate is this mimesis version of representation, where again elected officials are mirroring the electorate. And that is problematic, at least for two reasons. One, because it excludes marginalized population and other minorities. And second, because at least according to some political theorists, this notion of being the voice of the people forecloses possibilities or opportunities for constructive feedback and criticism. So we need a better notion of representation if we want to claim that value influence in the sciences is legitimate whenever they are representative of the public's values. So my main claim will be precisely to offer, my goal is to offer an alternative model of representation, and my main claim will be that a fiduciary model of representation is an inadequate, if albeit partial, framework for legitimate value influence within the sciences. And I will try to make that case in three parts. First, I will articulate the problem a little further. Second, I would present what the fiduciary model is. And third, I will explain why I think the model is adequate. Okay, so let's start with the problem. We need to articulate the problem a little further just to lay out some criteria by which we can discuss the adequacy of the solutions that we are offering. The first thing we need to do is to realize that the problem we are discussing here is really the classic problem of legitimate representation, but applied to the concept of value influence within science. When we are looking for values, which can influence or can be used to influence science in a way that is not undermining public trust. We're really looking at the ways in which scientists can use their authority to choose and use values within their work in a way that, again, respect the public's interest and fundamental freedom. And that's basically the question of representation as legitimate authority. And the question of representation as legitimate authority is really a classic question that is typically divided up into two sub-questions in political theory. One is who is represented, and second is what are the proper mechanisms for proper representation. So in the context of science and values, the question of who is represented is going to be the question of whose values are represented. And that also can be divided up into two questions. One is the problem of inclusion. And that problem consists in saying that proper representation must account for marginalized population, minorities, and other disenfranchised populations. And then the second problem is the problem of aggregation. Given that we should expect conflicts to arise and opposite interests to be at play, we need to have a way in which we aggregate the various possibly conflicting interests within the public to give proper representation. So those are the two main problems within the question of whose values are going to be represented. And then the second question is which institutional mechanisms are going to help us ensure that proper representation is taking place. And that divides up into two problems as well. The first problem is the problem of authorization. And that is the question of what kinds of mechanisms are going to ensure that authority holders are given proper authorization for their authority. And then the second question is the question of accountability. And that question is which mechanisms are going to ensure that authority holders receive and are responsive to critical feedback. Okay, so we have four problems that a proper theory of representation for value influence within science ought to be tending to or respond to or say they don't have an answer to. But those are the first four problems. In addition to that, I want to emphasize that in the context of science and values, we have an extra problem to pay attention to, and that's what I call the problem of expertise. And the problem of expertise is that there is an asymmetry between the expertise of the scientist and the public. And that means that any adequate account of legitimate authority should give the authority or the expertise of the scientist its due, while also respect the public's interest and fundamental freedom. And what I would argue is that this amounts to some level of expert paternalism that should be authorized within science and values, but the kind of expert paternalism that is legitimate, which is still respectful of the public's interest and fundamental freedom. So that's the last problem of our 5 problems that we have now, as being the problems we need to cover. The problem of inclusion, the problem of aggregation, the problem of authorization, the problem of accountability, and finally, the problem of expertise. Okay, so I laid out our problems that basically make up our larger issue of defining representation in a way that is adequate for the context of science and values. In the rest of the paper, I want to make the case that the fiduciary model of representation is an adequate normative framework for that. So to do that first, I need to explain what the fiduciary model is. So you all have heard of fiduciary relationships. For example, a fiduciary relationship could be between an attorney and their client, or a guardian and their ward. But more pertinently for us, I want to consider in our head the example of the relationships between corporate office holders, shareholders, and stakeholders. Those concepts come from private or corporate law. Advocates of fiduciary political theory import the concepts into public law to make sense of government authority, adjudication, administrative authority, and more. That's what they do. And what I suggest is that we import those concepts from fiduciary political theory into the context of science and values to make sense, or try to make some sense of how values or scientists can have some kind of authority over some values that they use within their work. Okay, so that's the background, basically. Now, what is a fiduciary relationship, right? So some elements of a fiduciary relationship are the following. First off, a fiduciary relationship is a tripartite relationship between an authorizer, the fiduciary, and the beneficiary. The authorizer authorizes the fiduciary to look over the assets of a beneficiary who benefits from the fiduciary's interest. The fiduciary typically is considered to have discretionary power over the assets of the beneficiary. Which puts the beneficiary into a position of vulnerability, because the beneficiary typically have few avenues for complaints about what the fiduciary does. And especially because the beneficiary typically lacks the kind of expertise that would be necessary to even assess what the fiduciary is doing. To regulate this asymmetrical relationship between the fiduciary and the beneficiary, the fiduciary model imposes duties onto the fiduciary to make sure that they indeed work in the beneficiary's interest. Typically, those duties are described as being duties of loyalty, care, and fair dealing. As a result of this proper regulation, ideally, as a result of this proper regulation of the relationship, there is a relationship of trust, that is, the beneficiary trusts that the fiduciary is working in their interest. So that's roughly the structure of a fiduciary relationship. And as you can see, what really, I mean, the crux of the relationship is this notion of fiduciary duty. The notion of fiduciary duty is crucial because this is really what helps us regulate the asymmetrical relationship between the vulnerable beneficiary and the powerful fiduciary. Those fiduciary duties are really what imposes, norms on the behavior of and the actions of the fiduciary. Okay, now those fiduciary duties are norms, a norm of behavior, norm of action, and it's useful to say more about them. And thankfully, there is an analysis over there in Fiduciary Political Theory, published by Leib and Galoob in 2016, on which norms are at the core of those fiduciary duties. If this thing wants to do it, there we go. And what Leib and Galoob say is that there are three norms at work, core norms at work within fiduciary duties. The first norm is a norm of deliberation, which is a norm on the attitude of the fiduciary. So fiduciaries would violate their mandates if they acted in such a way that the result is in the interest of the beneficiary, but their attitude is not the proper attitude. In particular, they should not be, it would be a violation of their mandate if the result of their action is a benefit to the beneficiary, but by accident. They need to be deliberately trying to work for the person's interest, the beneficiary's interest. So that's the first thing, a requirement, an attitude requirement of deliberation. The second aspect, the second fiduciary norm is a requirement of conscientiousness. And it goes further than the deliberation requirement in that it's not only that the person needs to be deliberate about serving the beneficiary's interest, but needs to do it for the right kind of reasons. So, for example, it would not be a right kind of reason if a fiduciary tried to deliberately work to the beneficiary interest, but not because of directly wanting to work in the beneficiary's interest, but indirectly because it serves a different purpose. Maybe the beneficiary is at the same church and the fiduciary wants to do good things for the people from the same church. Or maybe, the fiduciary wants to date the beneficiary's sister, or those kinds of things. So that is an indirect attention to the interest of the beneficiary, which makes it the wrong kind of reason for being deliberately trying to serve the interest. The third norm that Leib and Galoob describe is the norm of robustness. And what's interesting about robustness is that it introduces an element of a contrafactual element in the discussion, in the sense that if the circumstances had been different, then the fiduciary would have had to do something differently. Of course, in case of relevant differences and then relevant differences call for relevantly different actions. In particular, this includes an updating requirement. That is, it is part of the robustness requirement that the fiduciary seek out new information about the interest of the beneficiary and be responsive to that new information, which I find we'll see will be quite interesting for us. Okay, so we have those norms, and now what I want to say is that this entire model can shed some interesting light, bring valuable insights on how to conceive of representation in the case of values in science. Okay, and the way I'm going to do this is in two steps. The first step is going to show that there is a structural fit between the kind of fiduciary relationship and the relationship between scientists and the public. And second, I'm going to argue that the model sheds interesting light onto the problems, the 5 problems that I laid out during the first part of the talk. Okay, so let's do it. First is the question of structural fit. So that is important, obviously, because remember that one of the reasons why I rejected the Folk's theory of representation is precisely because scientists are not elected and cannot be elected out, right? So there needs to be a minimum fit between the kind of structures within domains, within the 2 domains. So in the case of the fiduciary model, the tripartite relationship is a good fit. The public doesn't authorize the scientists directly, but instead public agencies, private actors, other universities, and other authorities lend authoritative power to the scientists to conduct their research programs in the public's interest. So we have a tripartite relationship here. There is just largely discretionary power on how scientists complete and conduct their research. There's very little accountability when choosing how to conduct their research, besides some minimal accountability regarding like human research, but otherwise they have pretty much carte blanche. So we have this element of discretionary power, which of course puts the public in a situation of vulnerability, since the public doesn't have many avenues to complain about the scientists' actions, and also the public lack the kind of expertise that is necessary for even assessing the situation in scientific research. And so ideally, what we want, remember, this is our ultimate goal, right? Ideally, what we want is that the public, despite this vulnerability, this possibility of abuse, despite this discretionary power, this asymmetrical relationship, trust that the scientists are working in their interest. And if we believe that the fiduciary model is a decent fit here, then what it tells us is that one way to regulate this asymmetrical relationship is precisely to impose fiduciary duties onto the scientists as they conduct their research. Okay, how is that idea going to help us with the 5 problems that we laid out earlier? Well, the first problem was the problem of inclusion. If you remember, the idea was to make sure that in the process of representation, we include the voices of disenfranchised population, right? What I want to say here, and what many people working in fiduciary political theory argue, is that precisely this is possible because of this tripartite structure. So instead of having representative representing their electorate and their electorate only, here the process by which people are authorized and the process by which people work in the interest of are different, which means that the fiduciary have leeway, the room to work in the interest of the beneficiary, even if the interest of the beneficiary contradicts the interest of the authorizer. So because of that tripartite structure, there is more room for the fiduciary to take into account all kinds of interests instead of just the ones that elected them. The second problem was the problem of aggregation. And I am certainly not claiming that the fiduciary model of representation offers a solution to the question on how of the mechanisms by which, and the precise mechanisms by which, we're going to aggregate conflicting interests and values. In many ways, this is not well, first off, this is not the question that this model can answer. Second, I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all answer to that problem. In fact, I think that the people working right now on importing concepts related to deliberative democracy are working on that issue, and you know pretty much are going to tell us that this is context dependent. The proper mechanism for aggregation is going to depend on on the situation, the particulars of the situation. So it doesn't give you a mechanism, a one-size-fits-all mechanism by which to aggregate various interests. What it does give you, though, is a norm of attitude when it comes to implement whatever rule or whatever mechanism you decide to implement to aggregate. And that norm is a norm of attitude, which forces, or at least tells whoever is doing the implementation to seriously consider the interests at stake. And that's because of that notion of fair dealing and the duties associated with being a fiduciary. Fourth problem was the problem of authorization. Here, our worry is often that authorizers do not choose for the right reasons. And in the fiduciary model, authorizers choose the fiduciaries for their expertise, experience, and track record of fair dealing. And that seems to me to be a very beneficial element of the model, in the sense that this forbids the untrained, the unskilled, or the biased or the partisan representatives. So again, I think there is value here in having those norms on how to, authorize or elect the people that we choose to work in our interests. The fourth problem was the problem of accountability. And here, so the question was, how do we make sure, what kind of mechanisms ensure that scientists are responsive to critical feedback? And there are avenues for critical feedback. And here, I think, again, that the fiduciary norms can serve as a yardstick for proper behavior. And in particular, I want to point out that this notion of robustness, which is a requirement that the fiduciary updates their knowledge on the beneficiary's interest and be responsive to that updated information, in the sense that they ought to change their behavior and their action on the basis of those updates. I think that's actually a very interesting way in which we can ensure that feedback is happening and responsiveness to feedback is happening. Finally, the fifth problem was the problem of expertise. And the problem of expertise, remember, was to strike that balancing act between the expertise of scientists being given its due and the interests of the public being respected, and as well as their fundamental freedom. And I think the fiduciary model does a fine job with that problem, in the sense that first, it does recognize the importance of expertise, in the sense that the authorizer lends authority and discretionary power to the fiduciary to exercise on the basis of the fiduciary's expertise, experience, and fair dealing track record. And I think that's given enough authority to expertise to do what it needs to do. But at the same time, that expertise is not absolutely, unconstrained, but rather is highly constrained by the fact that the mandate is to serve the public's interest. So there are limits on what the experts can do. And so I think it does it arguably strike the right kind of balance when it comes to conceive of some notion of legitimate expert paternalism. So if all of what I said is correct, then we have in our hands a model for the relationships between scientists and the public and various funding founding organizations that could give a good normative framework for how values can legitimately influence scientific work. Um, I've encountered a few objections as I'm giving this talk here and there, and so I want to address a few, and I'm happy to say more if anybody has any interest in doing so. Um, One objection that I have received is that there is a question of layers, right? So who is going to be a fiduciary in that model? Is it the agencies, let's say the NSF, or the NEH, whatever it is, right? Or private funding organizations, or is it the scientists themselves? Is it everybody in the lab, down to the undergrad student who is entering data into a software? Probably not, right? So there needs to be some conception of layers of responsibility and who is bearing the duty of making sure that some values are implemented and not others. Um, I think that there is not a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. I think it's likely to be context dependent, especially depending on the kind of funding system that we are looking at. As a way to make a quick answer, though, before I do more work on figuring out for each of the possibilities how that could work, what I would say is that if Wendy Parker is right in her last paper about how, at least in some scientific contexts, it is possible to front load a lot of the value decisions, then probably it's during that front load work, that front loading, that those decisions are made, that people bear the responsibilities to decide on those values as being values that serve the public. And then those people are really the ones who need to make sure that those values are implemented throughout. So that's probably the PIs and maybe some other people around there who make the decision again in that first um, uh, uh, first step before a research project is completed. The second objection that a lot of people have been raising is the notion of enforcement. So who is going to enforce the mandate for fiduciary duties? And is it a good idea to bring the courts into science? Well, maybe, maybe not, right? The courts are not the ideal, just like any other institutions we have in our democracies. They still do good work, even sometimes they err. That doesn't mean that the courts are evil. Some cases have taken place already, and in those cases, I mean, there was outrageous behavior, right? And maybe it was not a bad idea to be able to say, you failed the public in those cases. You failed, and having a conceptual tool to say exactly how those people, those scientists have failed the public would be useful. And interestingly, in some of those cases, questions of attitude, of what the people were doing in terms of attitude, mattered. Then there is a question about the lack of epistemic access to values in general, which I am not too keen on. I mean, I agree that we might not have absolutely transparent epistemic access to our own values, that scientists are not trained to do that. That says, I also think that some work can be done. And even if we don't have maybe, and if we want to really, so first off, I don't think that individuals are that, that much of a black box. It's not that hard to get people to think about the values that are behind their work. But even if that were the case, that individuals are black boxes, I think that we have enough, social studies, critical race studies and feminist studies to show that sometimes we can just figure out what values are at work in some institutions. So I think that we have epistemic access, and we have the ways to some epistemic access to the kinds of values that are at work in the background in a lot of our institutions and practices, including scientific practices. Finally, some people have objected that there is already an area of science slash law in which there is a notion of fiduciary duty and trust, and that's the public trust doctrine, which applies to conservation science. And some have argued that the public trust doctrine didn't work, right? The public is not served well by the various agencies that are supposed to represent the public interest when it comes to the management of the lands and other resources, natural resources that are owned by the public. And what I would say is that I would argue that it actually served a very specific set of values, which is called the North American model of wildlife conservation. And if we think that, like many do, if we think that the North American model of conservation may not be the most accurate set of values that is representative of the public as in this day and age, even if it might have been, a century ago, then what you do is that you make the case on the basis of the duty to serve the public's interest. And I think in a large portion, at least in my work, to a large extent, this is exactly what's happening with people going against agencies working on conservation, precisely saying that they are not doing their job defending the resources, natural resources, in a way that corresponds to everybody's interest, including non-consumptive users. So that would be my answer to this, and I'm happy to hear other questions from the audience. Let me conclude. I've been trying to argue that if representative values are to be deemed legitimate when influencing science, then we need to specify what we mean by representative. I've argued that the folk theory of representation is not acceptable, but that a fiduciary model of representation, which imposes fiduciary duties and mandate that the public interest be served in the right kind of way, provide an adequate, albeit partial, normative model for value insurance within science. And that will be it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the talk. So let me remind you how we're going to be proceeding for the Q&A. Please, if you have a question for our speaker, write your name in the box, in the chat box, and I will promote you directly to a panelist so that you can actually ask the question yourself rather than me having to do the translation. So go to the click on chat at the bottom of your screen, write your name, and let me promote you to panelists so that you can ask the question directly. All right, it's going to take a few seconds to do that. Okay. I assume that those who have raised their hands want to ask a question. You give instructions, but no one's following them. It's fine. Carl, I'm promoting you to panelist, and Sandy as well. All right. Carl, please, floor is yours.
Yeah, I would have liked to follow your directions, but somehow I entered without the proper credentials, so the chat was disabled for me.
The chat is completely disabled, so you need to have that fixed.
Oh, this is a new
Okay.
version of Zoom. Yeah. So we have the new. Apologies for that. So we're gonna need to find new technical solutions, given that we've been downgraded in our Zoom access. We don't have chat anymore. All right. So raise your hands as the smart people have done on their own. Carl, floor is yours, and then Sandy.
Thanks, Soazig. It was nice to hear this talk again. Having heard it in Hanover, I liked it both times. Today, the question I have is about whether this fiduciary model requires a great deal of changes because of the mismatch between the model as you're articulating it and the incentive structures that currently exist for scientists when they're doing research. And what I'm thinking of is that I've been looking at papers about the reproducibility crisis and lack of trust in science because of rampant p-hacking and data fraud and things like that. And we seem to be in a situation where there's a lot of bad research being produced at great volume and paid for by the funding agencies and rewarded by universities and other bodies. And it's all absolutely contrary to the interest of the public and the real public that is financing in the end all of this. So wouldn't it kind of take a big effort of somehow rearranging, restructuring the whole incentive structure for working scientists to get this to start working?
Yes, probably. Right. So the incentives are not to be serving the interest, but rather to publish and get tenure and right. That's what the intent. There was actually a beautiful talk about that at Pitt when I went last time in the spring. And of course, I can't remember the person who the name of the person who gave that talk, but it was a great talk, and I can find it at some point. Yeah, so I mean, I don't think that this model is going to solve this structural problem in the institution of science. I think that would be a tall order for, I do think that it could give some conceptual tools to articulate what's wrong with that kind of behavior and what is failing in terms of what, the scientists are doing when they are p-hacking or those kinds of things. So it's certainly not like a practical, step-by-step model on how to fix science. But it is hopefully some kind of conceptual tool to properly articulate what's wrong with what they're doing.
Thanks. Let me remind you that if you want to have a question, since we don't have the chat, please raise your hand on the screen. Could you just get off out of the main screen? I think that would be a bit more pleasant if you.
You want me to stop sharing?
Yes, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be slightly more pleasant. All right. Sandy, floor is yours.
Hi, Soazig. Thank you very much for this. I think this is an intriguing model, and I want to explore one aspect of it that is a little puzzling for me. And that is, it seems this fiduciary relationship is typically structured, and I don't know the political scientist's use of it, but in terms of individuals who are representing other individuals in a context where the rules and obligations are fairly explicit. They're either law or financial. And so there seems to be a lot of differences between those features and science. And so I did want to explore a little bit in what you keep talking now about the public interest, okay, is what's supposed to be kind of respected by science. But this other individualized notion of fiduciary relationships in terms of explicit, either quantitative financial or explicit legal things, I just don't see how that. Can you explore some of the reasons why those differences between science, what are the norms of science that can come in conflict with different individual norms? And then there's this question about the public interest. How does that get modeled here?
Yeah, so I think you're pointing out one of the main objections that a lot of people have had against this idea of importing either private or corporate law concepts into public law, and that's precisely this kind of nebulous notion of public interest, right? In comparison to I want more money, and which is
not
very
to be arrested, right?
right. No, exactly. So that's definitely a large portion of the conversation in the fiduciary political theory is especially on that topic. So I do think it's a real question, and I do think it's an important question. What I would say is that at least I feel like there is and I want to explore that more, right? This is still work in progress, but what I want to explore is how that is conceived in precisely conservation science, right? Where there is a public trust model. So people have been thinking about this already, about how we can look at what does it mean for the public to own natural resources, whatever that means, right? And how our agencies and the scientists within those agencies, within FWP and other agencies looking at natural resources, how are those scientists supposed to serve the public? And they are mandated to protect those the natural resources that are legally owned by, that are the interest of and legally owned by the public. So that's what I want to look at. I think that we have a model of how this is supposed to function. I don't know if it functions well, but I think there is a way at least to conceive of it as a possibility, to see, to delineate a reasonably clear set of interests that a particular public has regarding particular research, right? So it's not going to be like all of the public's interest of all times. It's probably going to be depending on what kind of research you're doing and how that is related to how the public is linked to it. And in many ways, the NSF has a mission statement that, says that you have to do things, right? And in their case, there is something about the military, there is something about basic science, and there is something about making the society a better place, basically, or promoting the interests of the public. So those notions exist, but it is definitely a discussion that I want to have in the paper that will happen one day.
Okay, thank you.
When I'm done writing the book on something else.
Right. Aliyah, floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, I'm sympathetic to the idea. Maybe like Sandra, I can see a lot of differences between sort of the standard application fiduciary model and the application that you have in mind. And I'm just trying to make sense of how to fit the model onto some phenomena. But I'll trim down the question a little bit. I'm not quite sure what the difference in like norms between the authorizers and the fiduciary, I guess the scientist with fiduciary role is exactly. Like, are we thinking that the NSF is an authorizer or fiduciary? It's going to be hard to pull apart their sort of responsibilities from the responsibilities of a lab, like a PI or something like that, right? And so I'm just, since a key part of this model is that there are three different components that are counterbalancing each other, I'm not quite sure I see this principal difference between two of those nodes. And so I'm struggling to evaluate the proposal. So I don't know if you could help me make sense of it there.
Yeah, so that's the question of those layers, right? And who is bearing what duty exactly? So I think there probably are several options here. And I'm not sure I have to necessarily say this is the right one. Maybe I do, but I'm not sure I do. I could see how, the NSF is part of the fiduciary, the scientists as well, at least the PIs. And then really the legislature is the authorizer when they make the final decision on who gets the grant, right? I remember being on an NSF panel and we were giving recommendations. We were never making the decisions, right? So that could be one way. You could also say, well, the agency in NSF is the authorizer, the scientists are the fiduciaries and the public. I think in many ways, as long as you have this notion that it is possible it is not necessary. So let's say legislature and agency scientists, as long as you make it possible to have not only shareholders but stakeholders, and then it's not necessarily the case that the scientists are mandated towards the shareholders only, but also towards the stakeholders. That is, they need to take into account a variety of perspective in addition to the people who directly authorize them. I think that is the notion that I want to use. And the details about who is who in many ways maybe are less important to me. I think it's a discussion to have, but it's really for me the important conceptual distinction here is between that a fiduciary ought to be able to serve the interest of their stakeholders without necessarily, even in cases where it goes against the shareholders' interests. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. Could it be, I don't know whether, do you have time to follow up, Edward? Yeah, okay. Is it possible to have the same sort of entities performing sort of dual roles of like operating both as authorizers or fiduciaries? Like maybe because I think you're right to say that there's maybe ways of partitioning the inner players in NSF, let's say. But since it does look like it's difficult to cleanly distinguish them. And so I wonder, is it necessary for your story to have them be different groups of people or just different sets of norms?
I mean, it would seem that someone could have several hats. That's not like conceptually impossible, right? So that's that would be my intuition at this point. I would like to look into it a little bit more, but it doesn't seem, I mean, I can serve as advisor and as friend, right?
Yeah.
And I will not have the same advice as an advisor and as a friend, or I can be a physician and give you um, some information, but then I can see, as a friend, I would tell you that blah, blah, blah. So I think we can play different roles. I don't see that there is something fundamentally contradictory with this, and I don't have a real problem with it. But again, I would like to be careful about,
Yeah, because it would be another relevant disanalogy between like
right.
with the private law case. Okay, I'll think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elia. Dan, floor is yours.
Yeah, there's some interesting convergences between this project and a project I've been working on, and also hope to find time to write one of these years. Sort of also drawing on a different corner of political theory to think about these questions. I wanted to ask also a question about the authorizers, maybe a little more pointed. This is a question of what makes the authorizers legitimate. So you said you've been talking a lot about like NSF and funding agencies as the authorizers, but I seem to recall during that part of the talk, you sort of included maybe like universities as authorizers. And that got me wondering, like, universities don't get any sort of formal authorization to, I don't know, do this kind of thing, even to the extent that like NSF does. Universities, especially like private universities, don't necessarily have a public mandate, for example, that public research universities do. So I'm wondering, like, how do the authorizers become authorized or become legitimate to gain this kind of authority to give fiduciaries their authority?
Right. I really like that question. So, yeah, in the case of agencies or federal agencies, right, we are going to have a legislature which has an authorization system by election. So that's pretty straightforward. Um, I agree with you that in many ways saying universities is not really useful. It's not clear that universities allow or authorize researchers to do their research. It's really not really, right? But even if it's not universities, it could be you could push your question a little bit more and say, what about private actors, right? Which ones are appropriate authorizers and which ones are not. I don't think I have a great answer to that question right now. I've been thinking in terms of public research largely, and I need to move in, see whether it works in private research. One option would be to say that whenever that private research is intending to influence policy, then there are some more regular forms of authorization that take place because you need to be contracted or something like this, but not always. So I've been thinking in the terms of largely public funding, and I understand that there's more work to do elsewhere. Well, it is possible that people do what they want in largely, and it's going to be very hard to explain why. I mean, we can say they have a fiduciary duty to defend the public's interest simply as a matter of fact because their work impact the public, and as for that reason they should. But I agree with you. Who is going to decide on who are the proper experts is going to be a difficult question. So thanks. That's not something I had thought about, this angle of authorization of the authorizer. So thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. So we have time for more questions if someone has any. But I will just to give people a few more minutes, I will ask you a question. I had a very similar question to Dan's question. I was interested in private science and how your model works in private science, which is as you probably know, most of science. In fact, much of scientific research is funded by private interests and private companies in R&D contexts. But since Dan asked this question, I have another version of the question, which is, who is the public here? So just imagine you're an American scientist and you're funded by the NSF, which only funds a small amount of money, but maybe the NIH, which fund more research. Is the public the Americans, or is the public the world? Is the public the current world and the future world? Is the public humanity? And I think that's an important question because interests are not aligned among all those people. What's good for Americans need not be good for the world, and what's good for the present world might not be good for all humanity, including our descendants. So I'm sort of wondering whether you have thought about who the public is here and how scientists should deal with that. It's not quite clear. I mean, it's really complicated for philosophers. It's not quite clear how scientists are going to be disentangling all these various interests, values, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so similar to Sandy's question, that's also a discussion that's quite present in that literature because of this difference between having very specific interests defined, specific targets, specific constituents, or those, the people who are in the relationship, right? So I think that what fiduciary political theorists would say is that you have to be pretty broad here and think about whoever it is that your research or your action is impacting. And that's again that distinction between the shareholder and the stakeholder. Whoever has stakes in not necessarily shares, but has stakes in what you're doing. And that means that it's a pretty encompassing notion of public and public interest. So yeah, I mean, when you think about medical research, as you were thinking, then there is the interest of the American public, but there is the interest also probably of people in the world, right? Because most of medical research should be expected to have impact on the rest of the world besides, first world countries. I'm okay with that conclusion. That would be fine with me. It makes it difficult, I agree, for the aggregation, right? But again, model doesn't even aim to give a particular mechanism for aggregation of conflicting interest, but gives you attitude norms on how you should approach the implementation of whichever rule you decided to use to aggregate interest, whether it's deliberative democracy or whatever it is, or, I don't know, surveys, international surveys, national surveys, I don't know. I don't have that model cannot answer that particular question of the particular mechanism, but definitely can give you some sense of what are the virtues, right? Or the norms of attitude you should have in that process, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, but I think it bears on the question that Dan was asking and the question I wanted to ask as well, because if really what matters is stakeholders and not shareholders, the source of funding should not matter a whole lot, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that American science is funded by the federal government, on your view, is, I mean, if I understood correctly, on your view, is not that relevant for decided whether.
We'll see. I hope it is. We'll see. I have to figure it out. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you just told us that for medical research, it's everyone in the world, but people in France don't fund American research. So the source of funding,
I see what you mean.
source of funding is absolutely irrelevant to know whether you belong to the public and to know whether the scientist has fiduciary duties toward you. So now I'm sort of wondering why you think the private public distinction is a relevant one on your view.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. The reason why, well, Dan's question was about how to choose the authorizers in the case of the private case. Sorry, in the case of the private founded research. So if that's the question, then that is something I haven't thought about. The reason why I punted, about private research is because I do believe it does provide the tools to include and to impose duties on even private research. But I also understand that how that authorizing process might not be clear in my head right now, and I need to figure it out. But I do think that ultimately, if this model is supposed to work, then absolutely there is no distinction between those two systems, precisely those funding systems, precisely because the stakeholders are what matters and their interest is what matters.
Good. So we have time for a few additional questions. Is there a further question? One, raise your hands again. Keeping an eye on you. 1, 2, 3. I guess this will be it for today. So I wanted to thank you, Soazig, for joining us, and thank you to all of you for coming to today's lecture online, the first online lecture of the semester. And I hope to see you soon, and hope to see you maybe in New Orleans in a few months.
Yeah, actually, I'm coming.
All right. Wonderful. So thanks again, and on behalf of everyone, since people can't really clap online, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you. Bye. Have a good one.
Bye.